particularly the process of recollections or remembrance processes, identity issues, gender issues, rural to urban relations. And now she will speak about her considerations from the field work she had with Bosnian refugees and war survivors. Please, Alenka, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I will try to share my PowerPoint, which is not as visually stimulating as some of the previous one, but I hope just to give you some kind of context. Um, Thank you very much for your invitation and introduction. I'm really sorry that I could not be with you yesterday for a bit longer, because I'm sure you already touched upon some questions and issues that I've been that I want to talk about. And today we also spoke about some topics that I will be talking about, this complex relationship between silence and telling a story, and also the importance of particular context and transmission of memories. And I will kind of try to continue here. Also, I have to say at the beginning that I've been thinking about these topics for a while, and I've been sitting quite for some time on this material. So I'm very grateful for this opportunity to kind of discuss my ideas that are basically related to my long-term ethnographic fieldwork in post-war Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also in post-Yugoslav Slovenia, as Zurška mentioned, together with my colleague Miha Kozorog. We conducted fieldwork research in among the Bosnian refugees, but particularly young Bosnian refugees in the 1990s who came to Slovenia because of the war. I also assume that you are quite aware of the context, so I won't go deeper into it, but if you need any clarification, please stop me and let me know. I'm just gonna read my paper. Hopefully it will not be too boring, but what I want to do is basically keep in time, because I'm sure that we are all quite exhausted by being for hours on Zoom, so I will just try to be brief. So although it is apparently not fashionable anymore to begin the presentation with the opening ethnographic vignette as we used to do, I will nevertheless take this route in order to illustrate the motivations behind this paper, which is an attempt to reconsider some epistemological and ethical issues related to the studies of painful and traumatic experience or memories among the war-affected people in post-Yugoslav space. What I need to also emphasize at the beginning is that my position here is somehow specific and to a large extent also influences my approach and attitude towards this issue, since I was born and raised in Bosnia and I moved to Slovenia in 1992 because of the war. And although I was never officially a refugee, I did share some experience with the Bosnian refugee community in Slovenia. So this paper is not only somehow academic reflection, but also a result of feeling of some sort of duty and my personal emotional need to talk about some issues that I think have not yet been adequately addressed. So if I go back to this vignette that I promised, in 2019, I was invited to a dinner, and among the invitees, there was a woman in her early 40s, very successful project leader, who also worked for various foreign intervention agencies in Bosnia. She was inspired to talk about her experience there, as some of us were very interested in her work. Although she traded the precarious project life in Bosnia for a stable position in the European Commission, she recalled with a great nostalgia the years of her meaningful job, especially story sharing workshop with the survivors of the war. Narrating the painful stories under the guidance of experts was, according to her, very important, not only for individuals to deal with their trauma, but also for Bosnian society as a whole. And this is also something that is taken for granted in transitional justice discourse, where telling the story about the past is crucial for reconciliation and restoration of the social relations in countries emerging from the violent conflict. Yet her recollection of time spent in the country testified that workshop intended to promote healing and coexistence in post-war country were most of all important for her personally. After 2 hours of conversation, I realized that she had no feedback about what the international intervention contributed to the process of peace building or to individual processes of coping with traumatic events. It was obvious that she did not occupy herself with questions, for example, whether this workshop in some way became a constant reminder of humiliation and intensified frustrations of victims. For example, she was not aware that many victims' suffering increased after giving some sort of public testimony about what had happened to them in the war. She spoke mainly about how her commitment shaped her own life. Above all, reconciliation the people in Bosnia granted her a secure future, and for her, this was just one of many completed projects. But for Amir, who was one of the dinner guests and whose father endured severe brutality in concentration camp, while he was a refugee in Slovenia, this was not a project, but a constant struggle with painful memories. During the evening, he said nothing. His face was kind of without any expression, but I think his silence was very revealing. And when we walked home, he said to me, and this is somehow a quote, "They advanced their careers on our misfortune, and then they even dare to talk about their love for Bosnians," end of quote. He clearly stated that he was fed up with talking about his or his father's trauma and that he just wanted to be normal like everyone else. At that moment, I also remember that Amir's affected reaction is something that I have encountered consistently during my fieldwork in Sarajevo already when I did my PhD research on anti-nationalism in 2008. For example, I was reminded very often by my interlocutors and friends that they felt like lab rats bred and kept for scientific research on the effects of trauma, war, and burdensome past. During one of my interviews, Darko claimed that dwelling on the past made him physically ill. For him, constant talk about the past was imposed by the ruling politician who used the tragic war in Bosnia to control the unstable future. Similar attitudes actually prevail in other research projects that I have been engaged with in the last 10 years. And while my topics change, these laments about obsession with the past events among researchers, politicians, representatives of NGOs, and so on, remain consistent. People complain that they did not want to remember their past every day or whenever somebody needs to hear the tragic story in order to finish their book or meet a certain project goal. I also felt guilty for posing some questions about the bygone times, although they were not central to my research, and began to think more eagerly about how ethical is to follow the dominant research stream and the prevailing epistemologies that often help to construct and not so much explore, for example, particular region. My paper is, of course, not intended to advocate the complete ignorance of the narrative's past. I'm sure we are all aware of the importance of hearing the stories. But what I'm trying to do here is to argue that it's of crucial importance to really listen and also hear our interlocutors. It is not just traumatic events in war and post-war realities that generate powerful emotions like fear, anger, disappointment, but also specific kind of political as well as academic dealings with the legacy of such trauma. Paying particular attention to people's responses to our research questions, I believe, open up a way to explore possible alternatives to some sort of empirical selectivity. In particular, I would like to point out that reducing people to narrators of traumatic past experience can have serious implications for their lives, but also for our understanding of the role of past experience in particular context. Doing justice to refugee experience as well as experience of war survivors require us to rethink critically about the ways in which both are constructed, not only in bureaucratic political media discourses, but also how different stigma is maintained in academic discourses. So while we can understand narratives of the past as well as storytelling as a way to maintain a sense of agency in the face of these empowering circumstances, since as Michael Jackson notes, to reconstitute events in a story is no longer to leave those events in passivity, but to actually reward them. It is nonetheless crucial to rethink our focus and conceptual tools in order to examine how trauma can function as a subtle mechanism of othering. Conducting fieldwork on the European periphery, which has been subjected to the discourse of othering for centuries, brings additional obligations and responsibility to us researchers. I'm sure you are all aware that the Balkans as some sort of liminal space has often been portrayed as a place burdened by history. Scholars have for long focused on violent episodes of Yugoslav history and the implications for the future. This limited but very pervasive focus on the memory of war crimes, violence, trauma, as well as impact on revisionist historiographies have often contributed to the reproduction of this Balkanist stigma. Thus, in this region, characterized as a violent post-conflict area, memory is also often perceived as violent. The whole process of remembering is often simply reduced to the logic of war of memories that can trigger a real war. As a result, remembering is often seen as a tool that paralyzes the long-awaited stabilization of the region and becomes the problem that requires international intervention as well as scholarly attention. Thus, narrating the stories about the past can be seen as fruitful and almost obligatory, but only under the guidance of objective outsiders. For example, on PowerPoint, you can see how these processes are perceived by locals, and according to the authors of interesting satirical guide, which contains a glossary of terms needed to master the language of international donors, entitled Ubleha for Idiots, with a very informative and very long subtitle, an absolutely unnecessary guide through civil society development and project management for locals and internationals in Bosnia and Herzegovina and beyond, written by Nebojša Šavija Valha and Ranko Milovanović Blank. Reconciliation is central concept of ethnopolitical rhetoric in post-war Bosnia. It is, I quote, realized when 2 or 3 representatives of local tribes from the ranks of ordinary people meet in a luxury hotel and under the wise direction of the dozen of international foreigners play 9 or 10 games from NGO handbook, end of quote. The supervisors in these processes are apparently uncorrupted internationals who have the supernatural power to see what no one else notices, as they claim, and also to be blind to the most obvious things. So you can see this is very effective satirical reaction. This of course brings to the fore often ignored power relation that enhance existing hierarchies, not only between periphery and center, but also between so-called victims and professionals. In addition, by focusing exclusively on the past and the impact of memories on everyday life, numerous studies in Bosnia follow this reductive reading of the life world of their interlocutors and cemented notions about the region as the most obvious example of the so-called return of history in 21st century. In recent decades, however, scholars interested in the complexity of the process of remembering challenged these dominant notions about the Balkans' preoccupation with the past through a very close reading of various strategies people use in their everyday lives in particular context. For example, in her very interesting article, Managing Memories in Post-War Sarajevo, Cornelia Sorabji calls for somehow reconceptualization of dominant approaches to memory work in post-conflict societies. Without denying the social construction of memory or social and political influence on remembering and forgetting, she argues that we should concentrate on memory management. That is, I quote, individuals' awareness of memory and his or her desire to control it for the perceived benefit of self and others, end of quote. Indeed, she notes that some of her interlocutors prefer to remain silent rather than talk about the past, as we also heard in other papers. And she read these revealing silences as a coping mechanism necessary for the survival in post-war reality. Silence about the past could also be interpreted as a strategic avoidance of the conflict and, in fact, as a moral practice intended to control transmitted memories for the benefits of achieving some sort of normal lives. Although such readings are still relatively scarce, they provide, as some others authors note, like Selimovic and Ismut, a more nuanced and in-depth picture by focusing on cultural ways of dealing with personal pain, local post-war realities, and quotidian social interactions. Thus, they also follow this similar direction, suggesting that silence about the past should not always be understood as oppressive and as a tool for practicing control over victims' narratives, but it may also help to create a sense of possibility for a brighter future. Advocating for silence, but of course not forgetting, which I have also encountered numerous times in my research, allows many to leave the past behind, attend to concerns of present, and look forward. While, as mentioned earlier, narratives and storytelling have been often recognized as agentive, in the particular post-war Bosnian context, silences can also be crucial to one's own personal sense of agency. From this point of view, therefore, it seems highly problematic that many scholars interfere with these decisions, but also effective reactions intended to guarantee a kind of normality in what is often called an abnormal situation, simply by forgetting that we are all active managers of our own memories and that most of our interlocutors are no less aware than scholars of the implication of political manipulations with the past. Therefore, I would like to point out that people who have suffered violence have often deliberately chosen silence about the past, as these agentive silences generate some sort of open space for nurturing hopes and aspirations, as we also heard before in the presentation by Professor Coutinho, but also for future-oriented actions in the post-war Bosnian context. This is why I believe that still somehow emerging field of anthropology of future or anthropology of hope can offer a very fruitful way to deal with some of our ethical concerns. So this refocusing on the future challenges the stereotype of refugees and war survivors being forever hopeless and helpless or completely dependent on the others. My experience testified that talking about hopes and aspirations can help people move forward. For example, I spoke with farmers in Bosnia about their plans for the future. With activists, I discussed their imagination of the ideal state and their vision of communities. So with former refugees, musicians that you can see on the PowerPoint, we explored their future prospects. Besides gaining some insight into various unexpected topics that emerged, this focus allows us to see the complexity of interlocutors' multi-layered lives. It brings to the fore other life experiences that are as equally formative to one's own journey and personal self-understanding as our traumatic experience of war and exile. And this was especially effective among the refugees who were marked by their refugee years and could not escape this label even more than 20 years after the end of the war. And as one of my friends and interlocutors often complain, once a refugee, always a refugee. Therefore, giving priority to non-traumatic experience, asking unusual questions about something that nobody cares about, and this is quote from my friend Mirna, can bring very interesting result, but also create a different relationship between researcher and his or her interlocutors. For example, in our research on music making by Bosnian refugee bands in Slovenia in the 1990s, we wanted to explore this complexity of refugee experience without drawing too heavily on the prevailing ideas about exile. What we discovered and analyzed in detail in one of the book chapters that we have just submitted for publication is that most of the former refugees in Ljubljana, as well as in Ilirska Bistrica, who were involved in music making, described their refugee years in Slovenia as the most beautiful time of their lives, and openly admit that they remember this time in the overcrowded refugee centers with severe nostalgia and with smile. And you can also read some of their quotes on PowerPoint. By talking about the past, but also remembering past future or some future they imagine at the time of their exile, we often open the space for the emergence of painful memories as well. But as said, they were marginal, not only in our research, but also in the narratives of our interlocutors, but also they use very different media to tell their stories in different ways, mostly through artistic work. So we learned much about the past through narratives about the possible or imagined future, both from refugees and from other people who were affected by war in other ways. As a precarious researcher, for a while I was working with non-governmental projects or agencies that design projects aimed to facilitating the so-called integration of asylum seekers in Slovenia in 2010-11. The aim of one of these projects was to enable people to shape their own representation in a public sphere through various media of expression, including, of course, art. And in one of these workshops that took place in Logatec, people from different parts of the world who have applied for asylum in Slovenia were kind of invited to visualize the stories they would like to share with the Slovenian public. So while some of them depicted their long journey to Slovenia by drawing roads and crowded boats in the Mediterranean, most of them drew national symbols of Slovenia and their country of origin. But for example, Nar from Afghanistan pulled me aside and showed me a drawing of the house with a beautiful garden. I assumed that this was her house in Afghanistan, but she explained to me that this is her Slovenian hisha or Slovenian house. She also opened her notebook from her Slovenian language class and started writing words in Slovenian for each segment of her drawing. She said she would remember her home in Afghanistan later, in her beautiful Slovenian garden under the fruit trees, when she rebuilds her life from the scratch. She didn't have time to remember. She was only interested in taking about things that guaranteed her and her family some kind of existential mobility, to use Hassan Hirsch's term, and stories that would lead them towards the desired future. Pulling her back seemed deeply unethical, and above all, she explained that she had to retell these stories of her life in Afghanistan, the reason for coming to Slovenia, her long and painful journey that led her to Logatec, to the police and state officials who in many ways denied her this capacity to aspire. With others, she just wanted to move away from the discomfort and talk about possibilities. These stories of possible future help her cope with the aftermath of exile, violence, bureaucratic reduction to being an asylum seeker and nothing else. Despite the language barrier, she was very eager to talk about her horizon of expectations. She also made me much more attentive to the possibilities and also necessity of intervening in these two fields of investigations, namely studies of anticipation and hope with memory studies. But what I learned from her and also from my other interlocutors is that not only do we need to rethink our approach to people affected by war and other traumatic experience, but we definitely need to rethink the current academic culture that advocates for fast science. Trauma research, research in the painful memories requires time. It is necessary to spend a lot of time with our friends and interlocutors to build or create some kind of intimacy and specific affective atmospheres that also allow conversation and emotions to flow. Long-term friendship and trust takes time. It also takes time to reflect and sit with the material for a longer period of time than is currently acceptable or allowed in academia. Even in anthropology, which is still considered a relatively slow science because of the required long-term fieldwork, the culture of speed, as Sherry Turkle argues, eroded interpersonal bonds and reduced social empathy. It also forces us to move more quickly between multiple projects and different topics. Long-term research among the same interlocutors actually allow us to see how they move forward, how they navigate their traumatic experience, and what other experience moved them out of the imposed position of being only a refugee or being only a war victim. It does take time and persistence to discover the complexities of everyday life, particularly in this post-war context. Moreover, what I'm also trying to suggest, and this is not extremely original point as it was advocated by many, most recently by Paul Stoller in this great article, is that one alternative to the culture of speed in academic research and writing is to follow the wisdom of our interlocutors and move away from what I have called stories on the go, something I had occasionally resorted to in order to meet various deadlines. And yesterday in a keynote lecture, we also heard that some people were prepared to talk for long hours, but were not ready to give interviews. And I think this is very important. For example, when I was chasing one of the relatively recent deadline for an article, I admit I just sent a quick text message to a friend who has actually been one of my crucial interlocutors in the study of music making in exile. And I asked her to provide some very brief information about the people who were mentioned in one of the newspaper articles that I discovered. And all I got in response was a very telling reply. I will just tell you all in detail over rakia or brandy, just come for a drink. So no information for me. Slow ethnography in a fast world, as Stoller argues, is the only ethical way to move forward, especially in the so-called trauma research. Just to conclude, and I think I'm in time, in this paper, I wanted to touch upon a variety of my experience and lessons learned from my long-term fieldwork and numerous conversations with interlocutors and friends, but also with myself. Consequently, this put me in a dialogue with a number of scholars who wrote about the importance of storytelling, as well as the importance of respecting the preference for silence about the past and traumatic events. Based on my research, but also on my personal experience of exile, I have tried to show how in certain contexts our ethical ideas about giving voice to victims may actually have severe negative consequences for the well-being of individuals, drawing them deeper into their tragedies and not allowing them to move forward towards the future they envisioned. Dominant ideas and epistemologies may simply lead us to non-listening and ignoring the most important messages we received during our fieldwork. So my attempt here was to somehow advocate for more future-oriented approach in order to give people with painful experience the possibility to escape the particular form of othering and to free them from the ideas that they are completely incapable of moving forward. By underscoring the unintended consequences of this empirical selectivity in our research, which often reinforced reductionist reading of everyday life, I wanted to show how our reorientation to future hopes, aspirations, but also past future might be very useful, but not only for our interlocutors, but also for us scholars and also our disciplines. I will conclude here. So thank you for your attention, patience. I think we have enough time for your comments, questions, if you are not too tired from the whole very productive day. Thank you.
Thank you, Alenka. Thank you for this thought-provoking presentation, and also for taking care about the temporal limits we have. Is there anyone who would like to pose the question first? I have to say that I was listening to your speech with utmost attention, and I was really glad that you addressed the slowness in the process of gathering material, in the process of thinking over what was gathered, and also in the process of interpretation. Because I think that this speed that is currently embracing us in academic work is doing no good to us nor to the people we observe and research. And this is something I would really greet this, and I think, I hope that this knowledge will also be considered by those who are doing the research policies. But what I wanted to, yes, I have very diverse experiences with people who were exposed to traumatic events, but some of them were really really wanted to speak their experience. Some of them refused to be victims. So there is a whole diversity of possible attitudes toward sharing the traumatic pasts. But I also think that maybe this is the real point, and also the post-war societies were often turned towards better prospects than to the troubled pasts. Maybe this is also the case why we only now open floor, part of the reason why only now we open the floor for traumatic events during the Second World War. Maybe people just need time to, this is my brainstorming now, maybe people just need time to deal with their issues intimately and start living again. I don't know. This is really something. Anna, you wanted to add something or to comment on it? Just go ahead.
No. Thank you very much. I so totally appreciate this presentation because I share many of the things that you said. And I think I would like to call our responsibility as researchers not to get on the bandwagon of the transitional justice professionals, who use templates and exactly neglect all these nuances and the shades of memory or trauma. There are people who want to talk, people who don't want to talk, people who want to be private, people who want to be collective, people want to stay home, people want to be active. And the transitional justice professional completely gloss over all these differences. And I even have a private, I would say, an individual strategy with my students or whatever I read. Don't ever use acronyms like DWP, dealing with the past. When something so complicated becomes yet another acronym that can be used by a UN report or any NGO report, I think we're really in trouble. So just want to thank you. I mean, it's exactly the shades of understanding that we need to have. I think there is nothing wrong in asking a friend for a little, writing an email if you were on the deadline. But this is a person you had a relationship with for 10 years, I don't know, 20 years. So that's okay. The same things we have experienced working with survivors. We said, well, we don't want to talk to some, they say Swedes because the Swedes go there. Some Swedes who come here for 2 weeks and ask us questions, as opposed to, researchers who have spent years talking to them, working with them, fundraising for them. And again, I want to say again, I don't see any bias in being a researcher who works with people who are victims of horrible crimes and do some activism on their behalf. So thank you. I think that should be really something we should be aware of and not fall into this trap. Sometimes it's good money, this consultantship, but we should just maintain a critical attitude and be able also to say no.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. I think Natasha Zlatović is another one.
Hello, do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Hello, Natasha. Can I just, before, sorry for interrupting you, Natasha, but she's my student, so I know her. I just want to briefly comment on what you said. I think what I wanted to actually do is actually depict this context, which is really overburdened by the talk about dealing with the past, as you mentioned, and so on. So this can have a negative effect, while the general idea is that we are helping people. In fact, this is something that is maybe preventing people to actually speaking with a researcher who, of course, have a very different attitudes towards it. But we mentioned the Second World War and this post-war time when nobody spoke about it. Now in Bosnia, in the Balkans in general, we have this flood of history talk that is maybe, as some of the studies already showed, counterproductive in many ways. So, and this text message, I just wanted to add that, yeah, maybe we need more time for everything. So I'm just very angry at this academic culture that does not allow us to actually sit with our friends, interlocutors, and with everybody else, because this is where the things that we are not thinking about emerging, So thank you so much for your comments.
So Natasha,
I want to add just one.
Okay.
They don't give us time to do that, and then it takes 2 years to publish an article.
This
is it my turn now, or
just go ahead, Natasha?
Okay,
Sorry.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for this presentation and your work. I would like to say something in addition to your presentation, is that from student perspective, what happened to me when I was in Kosovo, since I was there as a student from Serbia, and I attended in 2016, I attended the summer school in Pristina. So what happened is that something similar that you are talking about is that I was the only one from Serbia, so it was a summer school of more than 300 people. I was from Serbia and my friend, and what happened to us is that we were constantly being reminded that we are from Serbia, that we are somehow Serbians, and that we had, as a country, that country had a conflict with Kosovo. So basically, it was also a politicization of our being there as students, and reminder where we belong to. So a lot of these issues around universities and their relations to NGOs, and this work with trauma and post-war trauma also affected our presence there. So for me, it was terrible because every day they were reminding us who we are. We also were encouraged to go to some kind of visits of places that are related to war, which was very surprising to me because I applied there to meet other people, to enjoy university activities, and 99% of those activities were related to war. So I think it's a very, very interesting topic because this memory and constant reminder that we are somehow always connected to this past and not to our future, it's important. And I faced it while being a student. So thank you. That's what I wanted to say from this perspective.
Thank you, Natasha, for sharing your experiences. And I also have to add that I did this research among the younger generation, so maybe this is something that is also very important to note, because we were talking about this distance and how these things develop. I don't know, maybe in 30, 40 years, these people would like to talk about that experience. So that's why I'm promoting this long-term field work among the people. So because we also change during the time, and I'm also interested in different topics that I was like 5 years ago. So I'm sure the attitude might change in years.
I agree with you. We are changing, situation is changing. Is anyone changing this silence, maybe? Now we have a couple of minutes left, so maybe it's time for another question. Or another comment.
Can I ask a question to Professor Contini, because we didn't have time before, so if I may use this opportunity to ask a question. I was really intrigued by this story of two brothers who completely differently experienced this silence in the house, or these memories of the father. Can you tell us a little bit more why you think that there was such a difference between these two ideas about the role of traumatic memory in one household?
Oh, very difficult to answer, because it is like the patient of Dina Vardi. She wrote that usually in a family, only one brother, one son was chosen, so to say, in order to elaborate the mourning of the Shoah. Not all of them. So I think that I should have asked them why. I remember that during the interview, the younger brother was very angry with the old one. You see how my father is. He doesn't care about that. All our life was destroyed, and he didn't realize that. But and the other one was saying, "Oh, well, come on! It was not everything was in the past." Is also from, I think, maybe that may look a bit oversimple, but is very much related to people's personality, I think. But I'm sure that even in many situations, even in among children of people unable to elaborate the Shoah experience, maybe some children didn't react in that terrible way. It also depends on how the rest of the family behave. I mean, no, the extended family, perhaps. anyway, I would like to ask them more. They were very different even physically. I mean, the older one was just a big man. The other one was more subtle and more thin and more intellectual somehow.
Thank you. Very interesting. Yeah.
Oh, we are precisely on time. And now I would like to suggest that we have a quarter of an hour of a break. I would like to prepare some ideas for the conclusory remarks. And so you're free to have another coffee or to go for a cigarette or whatever. So let's meet at 5 to 1. And I also promise I will not be long because I know you're tired. But if there is any question that relates any of the speakers in these 2 days, you are free to discuss. Okay. So thank you again, Alenka, and all who were engaged in the discussion after your speech. Thank you. See you later in 15 minutes.